Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the lecture by Robert Szabo, who is the director of the Konkoly Observatory in Hungary, in Budapest. And he will speak about the Kepler and K2 missions. So please, Robert.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to give this lecture about the Kepler and K2 missions, which has been, both of them have been part of my life and part of my professional career in the last 10 plus years. And I just realized 2 or 3 days ago that what a big topic is this. Talking about Kepler's and K2 successes. It's even just barely touching a few topics that could take up a full week, I think. So I've been to several conferences where we discussed Kepler and K2 results. So that's a huge topic. So it will be subjective and not exhaustive, and not a complete list of these achievements. This is the outline of my talk. So I will talk briefly about the Kepler mission in general, how the space telescope worked, what were the advantages, and of course, a large part will be about the exoplanet results. In fact, Kepler opened up a new field, a completely new field, and revolutionized the whole exoplanetary science. But it did much more than that. Astroseismology is also a huge success, and Kepler made it possible to see the unseen, to see inside the stars, and in fact, anything that changed its brightness in the Kepler field and the K2 campaign fields were very thoroughly investigated, from supernovae to solar system objects, from flares, stellar activity, and open clusters, and a lot of other things. I will try to at least list some of these results, but won't go into details in any way. I'm trying to save some time to be able to answer your questions as well. And I will also mention the K2 mission and a few other ones, future ones or ongoing ones. I won't talk about TESS because, as far as I know, you already had a lecture on TESS. And if I have time, I will talk a little bit about KELPS and Plato, the successors and future successors of Kepler. So let's start with my favorite slide. I usually give many public talks, and I always start with this one. So once upon a time, touching a little bit of science fiction, because when I was a university student, as you are now, we didn't know any other planets outside of our solar system. So before 1995, that was a big question, actually. Do planets orbiting other stars exist? Because that was a very basic assumption in any scientific novels or films or movies. But once upon a time, there's something's happening on a distant planet, and that was just a question whether these planets are rare, do they exist at all, or they are very frequent. And of course, you all know the story. In 1995, Mayer and Kalo found the first exoplanet, which was later led to Nobel Prize to these two Swiss astronomers. But what about these days? So from none, we went to over 4,300 confirmed exoplanets, and more than half of that was discovered by NASA's Kepler Space Telescope. So that's why we are talking about this today. Just very briefly about the planet detection methods, because maybe it's a surprise, but not for astronomy students, that discovering exoplanets is not the same as taking images of exoplanets or using huge telescope to see those tiny dots or rocks orbiting around stars. But there are other clever methods. One of them is based on the gravitational tug of the planet itself. So it's a very rough first order estimation when we say that the planet orbits the star. In fact, the whole system has a common center of mass, and the star also moves, and there are ways to detect that tiny motion. That's the radial velocity method. When you see changes in the spectrum, if you have high resolution spectrum, then you can see that something is orbiting the star, so therefore the star approaches or goes away from you, and during this motion there's a blue shift and red shift, periodic ones, and that's possible to detect. That makes it possible to detect low mass objects around stars or even planets. The interesting thing is that that's the solar spectrum. That's what you would expect, and you see a lot of lines, and you can measure the positions of these lines, and that's what's changing during the orbital motion. The interesting thing is that the radial velocity method gives you an estimate, an upper limit of the mass of the star. Kepler works differently. It uses a transit method, which is based on the fact that if you are lucky enough and close to the orbital plane of the planet, then you will see that the disk of the planet transits the disk of the star, and there will be a tiny bit of diminution of the light coming from the star, and that's what we call a transit. And so you are all familiar with that. That's a very successful method. That's what ground-based telescope networks and also space-based missions like Kepler used to detect thousands of exoplanets. If you are to discover Jupiter-sized objects around solar-type stars, solar-like stars, then this light variation will be about 1%. And that's why it's enough to have small telescopes on the ground, and you are able to find these Jupiters, hot Jupiters, orbiting close to their stars. On the other hand, if you would like to see Earth-like planets, rocky planets around solar-like stars, then because of the size, it means that you have to apply much more powerful telescopes. You have to reach much better precision, because an Earth blocks only 1/10,000th of the light of the solar disk, and that's one reason we have to go to space to detect those. And that's the landscape. That was the landscape before Kepler. Kepler was launched in 2009, so there was 15 years to detect exoplanets, mostly with the radial velocity method. And you see the planetary mass on the y-axis as a function of the orbital semi-major axis, and you see hot Jupiters close to their stars, orbiting close to their stars on a few days orbit, a few dozens of days, and there are large Jupiter-sized planets discovered by radial velocity methods that were ongoing for a couple of decades at that time. But what was missing is the Earth size or Earth mass planets orbiting Earth-like orbits, so far away from their stars in the habitable zone, so-called habitable zone, which is a very loosely defined thing. For Kepler, it is enough to say that Kepler wanted to see and find habitable zone planets that are in the right temperature range to be able to host liquid water on the surface. There are much better definitions, of course, and that's a whole new area of research. But they show that these planets were missing at that time before Kepler. So the basic idea of Kepler is to monitor a large number of stars and monitor their light variations as continuously as possible. That's what you see on the left. So you have images, and the question is how to transform these images and these light detections, point sources basically, into something very, very exciting, habitable zone planets and many others. So the main mission of Kepler, when it was conceived, was to find Earth-sized planets around solar-like stars in the habitability zone using the transit method itself. Another thing it was not part actually of the original mission, but that was something that was possible. You will know your star only as well as much as you know your star, because the transit method gives you the ratio of the stellar and planetary radii squared. So it's very important to know very well the stars, and astroseismology is a way to do that. It requires the very same method. You need very precise light curves, light variation detection, and that's how it can help us to know better our planets as well. So it was not part, actually, I will talk a little bit about the history of Kepler. In the very beginning, seismology was part of the Kepler mission, but at the end, it has to be taken out. So it has to focus on something which could be very easily sold to NASA and the funding agencies. So unofficially, it was always part of it, and as you will see, it became a very important part of the Kepler mission. And in addition, I used to say I like to emphasize the thing that anything that went and that was in the Kepler field and the later in the K2 field, it was possible to look at those objects, and whatever whether it was a cataclysmic variable, whether it was solar system object, whether it was flare stars or spotted stars, whatever, you had a precision never before seen. That's why there were a lot of revolutionary results from anything else, any astrophysical objects that were detected by Kepler or K2 or any other space missions for that matter. So Kepler mission, the idea was to observe a large number of stars, 10 to the 5 at least, 100,000 of stars, for as long as possible. So that was a continuous mission, continuously monitoring the very same field. That was the original idea. At least 3, 4, or more years. And that's needed because if you are to detect Earth-like planets, which has an orbital period around a year, then you need at least 3 or 4 transits to be sure that you detected a transiting planet, a candidate actually, and there's a lot of work that goes into the verification or confirmation of any such candidates. So, and the other ingredient that's needed, I already told about that, is the high precision, very high precision. That was not possible before from ground-based telescopes, at least 10 to the -5, 10 to the -6. So we are talking about, we are not talking about millimagnitudes, we are talking about micromagnitudes, if you will. So 10 to the -6 is something that was possible for the brightest stars in the Kepler field. So there was an assumption that 12 magnitude solar-like star with a 6.5 hours of integration, which is the time scale of an Earth transit if you are looking at the solar system from far away, from the right direction. And there was another assumption that the stellar noise is below or close to 10 ppm, and there was a requirement that one had to reach the 20 ppm level to have an 8 sigma detection. That was the requirement. But the story begins long before 2009, when the Kepler was launched. Finally, one milestone is this paper that was written by Bill Borucki and his student in 84, 25 years, quarter of a century before Kepler was launched. So they already writing about how to detect planets around other stars, and you see that they already predicted that a large number of stars should be monitored with a moderate aperture telescope from space, if possible, and with a wide field of view. And that's exactly what Kepler became more than 2 decades later. The history itself is very interesting. Bill Borucki and the team had to propose to NASA 5 or 6 times, and every time it was rejected. So they were trying to do it and to convince NASA to. They had to demonstrate actually that this kind of precision is possible, and they even built such a laboratory instrument where they had to demonstrate that it's possible to detect light variation with such a small 10 to the minus 5, 10 to the minus 4 precision, and they had to demonstrate that it's possible to do it remotely, because at that time it was not that. We are talking about the 90s actually. That was not evident that it's possible, and therefore they were using one of the domes. You can see it on the bottom panel at Lick Observatory. So it was a struggle, and it took almost half of a career of one principal investigator, Bill Borucki. So you are not surprised that he became later the PI of the Kepler mission. And it's all about perseverance and a lot of hard work, actually. When you believe in something and you work for that for half of your life, and you see the results, that's really something. That's really outstanding. So that's the Kepler telescope. It's a Schmidt telescope. Actually, we have the very same setup in our Piszkéstető Observatory in Hungary. So those who are familiar with the Schmidt telescope will find it very similar, very familiar. You have a primary mirror and a Schmidt corrector at the front of the tube. And the heart of the whole instrument is a huge CCD camera system in the belly of the telescope tube. Actually, I will show other pictures here. So here are the most important facts: $600 million NASA Discovery mission. The detector system consists of 42 large CCDs, as you can see on one of the pictures. This is the primary mirror, still in the lab before launch, and this is the camera system. And you see 21 CCD modules consisting of 42 CCDs with large pixels, actually, and close to 100 megapixels. It is sensitive in the optical range, and it took slightly defocused images to be able to collect as many photons as possible, because what we really needed is a very good sign-to-noise ratio, and in this case you need as many photons as possible. Of course, since we wanted to observe the stars continuously, one had to put Kepler onto an orbit around the sun, and not an Earth-bound orbit. So it's an Earth trailing orbit, which means that it has a slightly longer orbital period than Earth, so it's 372 days or so. So it's during the years it got further and further away from Earth, and it was orbiting the sun. Still orbits the sun. So the original mission was designed. I mean, nominal mission was designed for 4 years, and the telescope itself was used. This was operational for almost nine years actually. So this is the telescope still in the lab. You can compare the size to human engineers there. And as I mentioned, it was Kepler in the original mission was observing a one selected stellar field in the northern Milky Way, close to the plane of the Milky Way, but not exactly at the plane. And the thing is that there were very short exposures. Exposure time was about a bit less than 6 seconds, and all these were stacked into longer cadence images. So the short cadence was not where 9 images were stacked. That was close to a 1 minute cadence, but most of the targets were observed with a 30-minute cadence. The short exposure ensured that even bright objects could be observed. On the bottom right, you see a very bright object, and you had to actually design very special aperture mask to contain and download all the fluxes and its variation. The interesting thing is that due to bandwidth limitations, only 5 or 6% of the pixels could be downloaded. So all the target had to be pre-selected before the launch or during the mission. One could change the targets, but one had to have a very good idea beforehand what to observe. And of course, most of the targets were selected for planet hunting, planet search. More than 150,000 F and K stars, but there were a few thousand other slots available, targets or target apertures that could be used by the Astroseismic Science Consortium, that's CASC, and also there was a very successful guest observer possibility where one could suggest any of their favorite objects. Many stars were observed, and even galaxies, active galactic nuclei, AGNs, and very exotic objects as well, because Kepler could reach a very nice precision that was not possible before. That's I think most of you are familiar with it. This is the Kepler original field in Cygnus and Lyra. And that's a fixed region, but it still searched only the vicinity of our galactic neighborhood. Okay, so we had light curves, and these are very precise light curves, but there were a few anomalies or problems with these light curves that had to be corrected. I don't want to go into details, but if one wants to work with these light curves, then you have to be aware that there are a lot of discontinuities and interesting changes and annoying changes and discontinuities. And one can, of course, get rid of almost all of these, but one has to be very well aware what was going on during the mission. There's a very extensive documentation, so I will give you a few links at the end of my talk where you can find all of those. So if you are interested and you are working with Kepler data, those are very useful to know. Actually, because of the design of the telescope, there were, as you might have noticed, I didn't mention it, but there was solar panels in one side. And when the space telescope is orbiting the sun, one had to make sure that the solar panel faces all the time towards the sun, and there was a radiator that had to be faced on the other side just to release the heat and to maintain a constant temperature as much as possible. And during this 1 year Kepler orbit, one had to rotate the telescopes every 90 days or so, and that means that there was a rotation, and the very same stellar fields and stars were hit by were observed by different CCDs, and that caused, at that precision, actually, it causes discontinuities. As you can see, different trends. We are seeing different quarters, 90-day sections of light curves, and you can see that it repeats yearly, annually. When I'm talking about Kepler year, that's not an Earth year. It's not 165 days. It's 375 days, or 72 days or so. But as you can see, these patterns repeat, and of course one can detrend, and one can have a very nice light curve when one takes into account all these changes, instrumental changes. I will skip that one, and the time flies. I'll start to talk about exoplanet results. Still in 2009, the first results were downloaded, and the first results were published 2009, 2010. One test object was a well-known HAT-PB7b transiting exoplanets. There were a few, three or four, I believe, in the Kepler original field that were all discovered by the time Kepler was launched. That was one of them. And you see on the top left panel a ground-based folded light curve, the discovery light curve that was published by the HATNet project. And on the right side, you can see how much better precision was achieved from space with the Kepler telescope, with a much larger telescope and with a much larger light collecting mirror. You can see the main transits, and even if you zoom in, you can even see the secondary transit, the eclipse. The planet moves behind the solar disk, and what else you can see is a very nice continuous sinusoidal variation, which is because what you see is not only the star, but the combined light coming from the star and the planet shows phase variations as it orbits the star, and that very tiny variation is clearly detected by Kepler. Let me call your attention to the scale on the bottom panel. What you can see is one tick mark is 0.00001, so 10 to the minus 5 or so. So it's very, very precise light curve. That was the first indication that Kepler works well. We'll be able to deliver a lot of interesting results. These are the first 4 Jupiters and 1 Neptune from the very early Kepler light curves. Most of them were bigger than the Jupiter. These are, of course, the easy ones. These are very easy to find in Kepler light curves, but we were interested in much more smaller ones, and these were coming. I'm just showing you a few selected systems because there are hundreds of thousands of them. Kepler 9 was interesting because that was the first multiple transiting system. Of course, these were people were looking for these in the ground-based data, but with small telescopes, HATNet, SuperWAPS, and WASP, and these other missions were not able to find these very interesting systems. Kepler 9 was the first one. It's a solar-like stars, as you can see, and they orbited by 2 Saturn-sized planets, Kepler 9b and 9c. There's an interesting mean motion resonance 2 to 1. And the interesting thing is that was also predicted well before Kepler, is that there's a strong transit timing variation. So there's a mutual gravitational interaction that's going on. And you can see that the transits occur not in a very strictly periodic way, but there's a strong interaction when when the transits of one of the planets comes earlier than the other one comes later, and you see these anti-correlated variations. And that was a very nice confirmation of theoretical predictions. Actually, and yeah, not only theoretical predictions, because we were very well aware that these kind of variations are going on in our solar system, but that was the first detection beyond the solar system. And it turned out that there's another additional planet, Kepler 9d, which is a super in addition to these two big Saturn-sized planets. Kepler 10b, I will just quickly showing this. This was the first rocky planet that was discovered by Kepler. And as I just said, the transit tells you the radius of the planet. If you know the host star's radius, you have to know it very well. So you have a size, and if you go to big telescopes and observe the radial velocity variations, then you will be able to derive the mass. When you have a transit, then you are in a good situation, because then you are very close to the plane of the orbit. That means that you can give a precise mass, not only an estimate or a limit, a lower limit, which means that you have a size, you have a mass, and that already tells you very important information about the bulk density of your planet, and it already tells you a lot about the nature of the planet, whether it's gaseous or rocky, or even in this case, which is much more, it has a higher density than Earth itself. It means that it has to be a very significant mass, a core mass, actually. Yeah, let's just skip to something else. Of course, there were many planets discovered, and I will talk about a little bit about the statistics. And of course, we started to see planets in the habitable zone. That was the original, one of the original goals of NASA's Kepler mission. Here, if you remember my first graph that I showed pre-Kepler, that's very similar one. You can see the orbital periods in a logarithmic scale on the x-axis, and the planetary size on the y-axis. And that was the landscape before Kepler was launched. And of course, during the years, a lot of additional planets were added to this plot. And that's what we first see after the first few months. I just want to show you the difference that already small planets below 4 Earth radii, so below the Neptune size, were showing up. And as we went further and further, it turned out that these are very, very, very frequent objects between the size 1 and 4 Earth sizes, so between the Earth and Neptune. And remember, in our solar system, we do not have any object between these two sizes. But it turns out that in the solar vicinity in the galaxy, these are one of the most frequent, most prevalent objects. And of course, that's a very interesting question, whether these are large Earths or small Neptunes, whether these are rocky planets or not. It's a whole different story, and whole conferences can be organized to discuss these possibilities. I won't go into details very much because time is flying. That's just a family photo of some of the planets and their host stars. You can see there are large stars and there are small stars, and these objects on the right corner is the sun, the small one, standing alone there, and this tiny black dot, if you can see it, that's Jupiter. So that's only just a scale to enjoy these huge number of discoveries. And it's very interesting to see the size distribution of these objects. And one would have naively expected that Jupiters are easy to discover with Kepler, and then we will see a lot of Jupiters. And it came as a surprise that that's actually not the case. The most frequent ones are more like Neptune size and smaller ones. We can talk about statistics, of course. That was a very early statistics based on the Kepler, and it says that at least one star in 6, or means 17%, has an Earth-sized planet on a close orbit, so less than 90 days. Of course, Kepler was sensitive mostly for these short period ones. Of course, Kepler cannot detect a Jupiter on a 5-year orbit or 10-year orbit. It's just not possible. It was sensitive to the short period planets, but it turned out that these planets are very abundant, and there are many of them. So there are some very nice statistics here, Earth-sized planets, and if you add up all the planet searches and radio velocity missions as well, then you will see that planets are very abundant. There are many of them in our galaxy. Of course, there are more sophisticated statistics like that, with adding many data came along since Kepler and K2 and TESS. And of course, there are statistics about Eta Earth, which is the frequency of Earth-sized planets in the habitable zone. I won't go into details. There's a huge debate. There are still order of magnitude debates and uncertainties. That's a very interesting subject to study. Of course, it depends on the stellar type. It depends on a lot of other things. But now Kepler and other missions made it possible to investigate these interesting factors and interesting laws in the nature. Kepler itself was contributing to these huge number of planets. Itself added several hundreds, and as I mentioned, more than half of the confirmed exoplanets were coming from Kepler's mission. One interesting thing, I won't have time to go into details, is the false positive rates. If you have a transiting exoplanet hunting mission based on the transit method, it means that you will have to deal with a huge number of false positives. For example, if you have a background eclipsing binary, that will show a very similar sign, very similar signal than, for example, a small planet. And if it's diluted, there's another star in front of or onto this background eclipsing binary, and then you might be fooled. And of course, you need other measurements, radio velocity, or other techniques to be able to confirm that you are dealing with a planet. The interesting thing is that in most of the cases, people are talking about false positive rates in transiting exoplanet missions like Kepler, and describe it with one number. And I just want to make sure that you will remember this figure. Unfortunately, it was not published. I was taking it from a conference slide, but earlier estimates were between 5 and 10%. The interesting thing is that it varies as a function of orbital period. Yeah, I'm talking about the lower left panel here. and also on the radius of the star. There's a huge variation. If you are talking about hot Jupiters, there's a much larger false positive rays, as you can see on the top right panel. It can be as high as 35 or 40%. And if you go to smaller radii, this false positive rate will be much smaller. So it really depends on what kind of planets are you talking about. So it's not possible to describe this whole scene with only one number. So it really varies, as you can see. There are huge variations. You have to be aware of that if you would like to compute meaningful statistics. And I just briefly mentioned that it's very interesting to see, first of all, that where is the boundary between large rocky planets and small Neptunes, for example. That's very interesting. It's somewhere between 1.6, 1.8 stellar radii. The other interesting thing is that it's not only a theoretical boundary, but we really see a boundary, and we see a gap in the size distribution in these planets. And this is a very hot topic. There was an exoplanet conference 2 weeks ago or so, and 5 or 6 talks were about it was exoplanets free, and it was of course virtual, but many speakers were talking about this. There's a gap or valley in the planet size distribution, and that's very interesting to see what is causing these smaller number of stars around 1.7, 1.8 Earth radii. And there are several theories that might contribute to the story. One is a core-powered mass loss. So if you have a very luminous and very hot planet, then mass loss can be important. And the other one is coming from the host star. There's a photoevaporation, high energy photons coming from the star, and then it will change the radius, and the planet might lose some of its or all of its atmosphere. Not only single planets were discovered, of course, but planetary systems as well, transiting exoplanetary systems. That's very important. I'm just showing. That's a very early statistics. You don't have to take it very seriously. One could go to the exoplanet catalogs and compute more updated ones. I'm just showing here one interesting system, which is Kepler 11. And you can see the row light curves on the upper panel, and on the lower panel, the smooth, detrended ones. And you can see 6 different transits coming with 6 different periods, which means that this is a system with very compact planetary systems consisting of 6 transiting exoplanets, and all of them are between the size of the Earth and Neptune. It is very interesting. It's very different from our solar system. Just reflecting on the science fiction that I started my talk with. Of course, that's a very famous scene from one of the early Star Wars movies. And here, what you can see is that there's a sunset on a faraway distant planet. But the interesting thing is that there are 2 suns, of course, which means that should be a planet orbiting a binary star. And interestingly, in 2011, Kepler was discovering the first Tatooine, if you will. That's Kepler 16b, which is a binary star orbited by a Saturn-type size object. So what you can see is 4 different types of transits. 2 comes from the stars themselves. So one is eclipsing the other, or the other number 2 eclipses the first one, and the Saturn size Kepler 16b is transiting both of the stars Of course, the occurrence of this transit is very interesting because the time of this transit is changing just because we have the binary motion of the stars itself. Here's a video, if I can, let me see. For some reason, it doesn't start. Okay, I will skip that one. The interesting thing is actually that I just want to emphasize that we are in a very lucky position in the solar system, and if in the detector sitting in Kepler, because we are in the orbit, very close to the orbital plane of this system. So these two stars orbit each other, and in the very same plane, the Saturn-sized object is orbiting these 46 or so day period binary stars on a 270 or 280 days orbit. So it's further out, but eclipses both of the components of the binary stars. All right, and that's not the only one. There are actually many of them discovered since then. Actually, millions of similar systems may exist in our galaxy. And so another curiosity is Kepler 37, where it has three objects, three transiting exoplanets, and one of them is larger than Earth, Kepler 37d. One of them is between the size of Mars and Earth, and the smallest one is very, very tiny. It's hardly larger than the Moon, our Moon itself. So it's amazing that these kind of objects could be discovered by the transit methods with Kepler. You can see that the tiniest one has a very, very small dip, a very, very tiny transit on the order of 20 ppm. This is really tiny, so one has to be do serious mathematics to tease out such tiny signals. Another interesting thing is, and that will lead us to seismology as well, is the system of Kepler 444, which is a M dwarf, and M dwarfs turn out to be very important objects because they are very, very frequent in our galaxy, and it seems that they also host a huge variety of planetary systems. And one of them is Kepler 444. The interesting thing is that it's a small M dwarf orbiting by 5 planets between the size of Mercury and Venus on a very short period orbit, less than 10 days. But the most important thing is the age of the star that was determined by astroseismology. And it tells us that this is a very old system. This is a very old star, almost twice as old as our sun. And which means that there are actually old planetary systems in the galaxy. And if these stars are not very active, then there's a chance that life could even emerge or develop for a very, very long time, for billions of years in other places in the universe as well. I will skip some of these slides because time is running, and I will focus on astroseismology for a few minutes. So Sir Arthur Eddington said in his very famous book, almost 100 years ago, that at first sight it would seem that the deep interior of the sun and stars is less accessible to scientific investigation than any other region of the universe. Our telescopes may probe farther and farther into depths of space, but how can we ever obtain certain knowledge of that which is hidden behind substantial barriers? He was, of course, talking about the interior of stars. What appliance can pierce through the outer layers of star and test the conditions within? And that's astroseismology, which observes tiny variations, light variations, radial velocity variations of stars, and very similarly to the method that is applied by geophysicists and who use seismic waves to investigate the interior structure of Earth. In a very similar way, observing these oscillations or pulsations, oscillations of stars, one can derive very interesting results concerning the internal structures and processes what goes on inside the stars. I will just go through a few slides. It's very interesting to remember that there are several excitation mechanisms that can make a star ring, if you will. And one of them, is the most important one in this context, is the stochastically excited modes. If you have a convective envelope, just as our sun does, or very similar stars, then it's the convective motion itself can excite these tiny variations, many modes, hundreds of thousands of individual modes. And the same applies to red giant, very interestingly. And these oscillations can be used to derive seismic measurements about the structure, the age, and other stellar parameters as well. There are other mechanisms. I won't talk about these ones here. These are just a few of the normal modes a star can pulsate in. And I will just skip a few slides and to spend some time here. And you can see that in the sun itself, and these investigations started in the 60s and 70s, there are a large number of modes that are excited by convection, and it is possible to see that different modes will map different regions of the star. Some of them will penetrate deeply inside, close to the core of the sun. Some of them will map the outer layers, and that's way it is possible to invert all these observations and infer the structure of the stars. This is for the sun. We call this helioseismology. You can see the sound speed variation and the density variation inside inside the sun. Actually, we can measure these quantities in physical quantities in a very good precision, which means that we can actually map out the interior structure of our sun, and we can do the very same thing for stars as well, thanks to Kepler. We can, for example, infer the internal rotation rate of our sun. That's also very interesting, and it changes, of course. There is a different speed of rotation on the surface depending on whether you are close to the equator or to the poles. That's a 3D representation of this rotation velocities, which is changing inside the star. Our sun rotates almost as a rigid body, and in the outer layers, of course, there's a differential rotation. It's a very well-known thing. But what is interesting is that you can see it actually from seismic observations as well. The main idea is to, if you are to observe these seismic variations in the light intensity variation, because there are changes in the light curve due to these tiny oscillations, and then you Fourier transform, and you will see a very regular pattern of these normal modes of frequencies. An interesting thing is, without going into the detail, is that this allows us to derive stellar masses with a precision of better than 5%. And the age is very important, because that's a very unique possibility to derive stellar ages, because there are quantities, you can see this, we call it small separation, which is sensitive to the chemical composition in the core of the star, which means that this chemical composition changes as time goes, and there's a possibility to derive stellar ages this way. And applying stellar models, one can derive also the radius, which is also very important. Just remember that to derive planetary radii, you need to know your stellar radius very well, which is obvious and easy in the case of the sun, but it's not that obvious at all for distant stars. Without going into detail, again, I just have to mention that for a star, it's very, very difficult to derive a precise age, and that's because a star like Sun, it looks very much the same for billions of years. So it's with the traditional methods, spectroscopy or photometry or whatever, it's very hard to constrain the age. But with seismology, if you have very good observation, it's possible to derive the age of a main sequence star. This is just an example what seismology can do for us. That's I already mentioned the HET-P 7b. It was discovered before Kepler, and you can see the radius of the star from previous measurements, and there's a 1 order of magnitude improvement when one applies seismology. You can see that with Kepler data, Jürgen Christensen and Darsgaard et al. was able to derive a much more precise size of the host star and hence the radii of the planet itself. One example here is this is a binary star, 16 Cygnus A and B. The interesting thing is that that's the comb-like pattern frequency structure that you can see in the Fourier spectrum. On the left, you can see one component of this binary system, and on the right, you can see the B component. So you can analyze them independently, and you can derive, for example, age independently, and this is very consistent. So that's what one would expect. If these stars form together, then their ages should be consistent, and exactly that's what seismology tells us. Both of them are 6.8 plus or minus 0.4 billion years old, and their chemical composition, bulk chemical composition, was also turned out to be consistent. And again, we could derive these quantities independently for the two components. And this is an Escher diagram actually when you stack on top of each other these very nice structures. They're very regular repeating, so it's possible to put on top of each other these frequencies and amplitudes and powers, and what you will end up is it is called the Escher diagram. It's very commonly seen in seismology papers and conferences. Another interesting thing is red giant stars, as I mentioned, because red giant stars also develop a very large convective envelope, and it means that these solar-like oscillations can be observed in them as well. Without going into details, it's very interesting that there are P modes, pressure modes in the outer cavity, in the envelope of these stars, and there are G modes, different type of oscillations in the cores. So it's possible to see both of them actually, because there's a way that these two kind of oscillations can couple to each other, which gives us a way to see inside the star these red giant cores and to derive information about the cores. One application is the rotation, or the internal rotation of a red giant on the main sequence, which is denoted by the blue here. You can see that the core on the left and the surface on the right has the very same or very similar rotation frequency, which is shown on the y-axis. And as the star ages, and we are going to yellow and red curves here, it turns out that as the star expands, of course, the envelope will rotate much slower, and the core will spin up, and that's exactly what you can see. Although these are I think these are theoretical curves, but that's something that could be confirmed by actual seismic observations based on Kepler observations. Another interesting thing is that there are two distinct evolutionary stages of red giants. In one case, the star burns hydrogen in a shell, and as it evolves, helium will start to burn in the core, and there's no way to distinguish between these two stages just based on some traditional methods and on bulk properties, because these two types of red giants look very much the same. And it turns out that because we have seismic observations that are sensitive to the core, there's a way to distinguish between these two stages, and it's very easy. Actually, it's a very easy measurement. We have to measure the period. So there's a period. The change in the period between consecutive position modes in the G modes, and actually it's very easy. You have to measure only frequencies or periods. That's very important and very easy measurement. The interesting thing is that these two types of stars, the blue ones and the red ones, will very nicely separate based on these observations. There are a whole lot of things that I could mention here. I will skip quite a few. Of course, as I mentioned, any types of stars could be observed with Kepler. These are eclipsing binary stars. That's a very interesting one because it stopped being an eclipsing binary, and that's because we were observing it long enough, and there was a rapid change in the orientation of the orbital plane. There's a third body in the system. This is very, very exciting, I think. Something that's showing eclipses and then it stops to be an eclipsing binary. There are very other things, but I have to skip some of those. I will mention this one, that the transit itself, if you have a transiting exoplanet or an eclipsing binary for that matter, it helps us or allows us to map the surface of the star, because if there's a stellar spot, just like imagine our sun, there are stellar spots, solar spots, because of the activity cycle. And if there's a transiting exoplanet that goes in front of the stellar disk, that there's a possibility that the planet will just eclipse or just cover the stellar spots as well, which are in most of the cases are darker compared to the stellar disk, which means that there will be a rebrightening during the eclipse. That's what you can see here, and that's a very nice method to map out the stellar surface, or at least in a very narrow band. But it already tells you a lot. There's a possibility, for example, to tell whether these planet orbits in the equator, close to the equator, or what is the mutual inclination of the star on the orbital plane. That's just very interesting things. There were literally hundreds of thousands of stellar flare events detected in Kepler itself and also on the K2 mission. Even supernovae were observed, type 1a, which are very interesting ones, and type 2s as well. Cataclysmic variables, I'm showing quite a few. There were 16 or so in the original Kepler field. And unprecedented light curves could be derived. There are outbursts. There's a disk around a white dwarf, and these are cataclysm binaries. These could be observed and investigated in very nice details. That was not possible before. And before I turn to K2, I talk a little bit about K2 mission. There's one interesting object I have to mention, and this is the famous Boyajian star that showed intriguing dimmings, which are not coming from a transiting exoplanet, because these are coming in very random way and very random depths. And there's been a long debate about what's going on in this star. These are the dimmings in larger details. The most one of the leading theories is that there's a huge swarm of comets or large bodies in the system that cause these dimmings. And there was another science fiction theme in this topic, in that one of the astronomers came with the idea that actually what we are seeing is a large Dyson sphere. Artificial structures are being built around these stars. Of course, that's not the case, but there are some interesting things. For example, these seemingly innocent F-type star shows an intriguing fading, for example, on a century timescale, and also on shorter timescales. And there's possibility that it just engulfed a smaller body, a planet or something like that, and theoretical predictions would match the observations. In this case, that's what we would expect, a secular dimming. It's a very intriguing thing. Without Kepler, we wouldn't have been able to discover such an interesting object. And let me, if you have a few more minutes, then I will talk a little bit about K2. As I mentioned, there's a huge number of topics I could mention. Kepler had to stop the original mission after almost exactly 4 years because one of these reaction wheels failed. Actually, two of them were failed. There are 4 of them on Kepler, and of course, there's no way to replace them. It's not Hubble, it's not orbiting the Earth. And these reaction wheels ensured that a very precise pointing was maintained during the primary mission, and that was a very important component to have very precise measurements, photometric measurements. But after 2 of these reaction wheels failed, NASA had to find a new strategy to observe. It was not possible to maintain one fixed field to be observed with Kepler, and that's where K2 came into the game. It turned out that it's possible to observe for 80 or 90 days along the ecliptic plane, and with only these 2 reaction wheels. And that's what K2 did, actually. And it opened up a lot of possibilities. Of course, one of the main topics remained the planetary transits, but as we were scanning for another 4 or 5 years, the ecliptic plane, a lot of other interesting things could be done. Stellar clusters were observed, both open clusters and globular clusters, star-forming regions, young stars that were missing from the original Kepler field were possible to cover. And a lot of other community-based, community-driven, community-suggested topics were covered. Actually, it was not anymore a planetary mission. It became a community mission, and the observations were planned according to the proposals, the observing proposals. There was one caveat, however, because these precise pointings could not be maintained anymore. And what you can see here on the left, you can see one hot Jupiter light curve in the red that was in the original Kepler mission, and there is a zigzag light curve right here showing in the K2 mission, which comes from the fact that the pointing was not maintained anymore with a very large precision. So there it means that the star moved on the CCD, which causes that kind of zigzag variations. But thankfully, it is possible actually to factor it out. And on the bottom right panel, you can see that from the blue raw light curve, one can derive very nice smooth light curves, which are almost as precise as Kepler. So it was possible to maintain very high precision. These are the fields. There was a possibility to observe microlensing events, which is very important because from the Kepler vantage point, one could see a parallax effect from ground-based observations and between Kepler observations that tells a lot about microlensing events. One could observe open clusters. Here you see how the Pleiades, and it turns out that all of these most brightest stars show actually light curve variations. You can see on the right, all of these are variable stars that we didn't know before Kepler and the K2. Of course, lots of planets were discovered. One of the most famous ones is TRAPPIST-1, which was not discovered by K2, but additional planets were discovered with the K2 mission. Planets were discovered in open clusters. That's very neat results. Actually, that's a multiple transiting planetary system in the Hyades. Very interesting. It was not possible before Kepler. Yeah, there's a possibility to use the red giant and to do galactic archaeology, because seismic observations of a large number of red giants can be used for stellar population studies and galactic archaeology. That's just one of the applications of K2. I would like to mention only one very special topic that we did in Hungary with a group of astronomers, and we suggested to observe solar system objects with K2. And of course, a very special aperture mask had to be this banana-shaped or this very curved path had to be followed and covered to see the motion of main belt asteroids or even trans-Neptune objects and a whole lot of other solar system studies. This is interesting because we could derive the rotation periods of these objects, which was not possible. This is not possible actually from ground-based observations, or very, very tedious work because of the change of diurnal changes of days and nights. It's a very, very hard task to do it, to derive rotational periods or light curves for these objects, especially if they have a long rotation period. You can see very faint objects here, below 20 magnitudes and 23 magnitudes actually. It's a very nice achievement that we could derive the rotation period of these trans-Neptune objects in that distance. You can see a movie here, a very faint object is going on here. One of the main discoveries was 2007 OR10, a trans-Neptune object where we could derive the size of this one, and it turned out to be the third largest dwarf planet in the solar system. I will go through this quickly. We were observing Trojan asteroids, even in the Jupiter's Trojan swarms. You can see it here, and a lot of main belt asteroids in large fields of K2 observations. Here you can see hundreds of asteroids with yellow paths that were possible to observe, and we could derive their rotation period, which is very interesting. It turns out to be the most important message here is that K2 showed that the rotation period distribution is quite different from what is seen from ground-based observations. There are many slowly rotating ones that we could see with K2, which was not possible to discover from Earth. And I'm coming to the end slowly. This is the number of publications from Kepler and K2. There are thousands of publications. So that's why it was a little bit of a mission impossible for me to summarize all of these results. And the K2 mission in itself is interesting because you can see the huge variety of astrophysical topics that were covered, from solar system to even cosmology and galactic archaeology and galaxy physics. Very important. I guess you will get this presentation, and that's why I put it here. If you would like to work with Kepler and K2 database, you can download everything. Everything is public. The documentation is also available. It's very important. And you can download all of these from the MAST, the Mikulski Archive for Space Telescopes website. And just a few slides about KEOPS, which is an ongoing mission, not to discover new transiting objects, but to more precise characterization of known planetary systems, and an excellent follow-up mission for TESS as well. It is now operating. It was launched at the end of last year, and the first light is in, and the first light curve is already downloaded, and you can see it here. So it works, and there's a possibility for guest observer proposals through ESA. And another European mission is Plato, that will be launched in 2026 or later. And that's another follow-up mission for Kepler. The main idea is to have not one single telescope, but many, currently 26 or so small telescopes. And these will observe the same field, and some of the targets. Now this is a design based on 32 telescopes still. Now it was reduced to 26, but in most of the stars will be observed more than one telescope, and that's how you can beat down the sign to noise ratio. Of course, you have to take into account a lot of systematics. And the interesting thing is that the Plato will cover much larger fields that CoRoT or Kepler or K2 could cover. There will be long pointings up to even longer than a year, and then there will be a step and stair phase that will observe small fields, large fields actually, for much shorter periods, 2 or 5 months each. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Robert, for a very extensive overview about the Kepler mission. And we have a few minutes for questions, comments, so please. Is there any question? No? Interesting.
There's 2 weeks hosted.
maybe I have just one question. Was there any unexpected surprise at the beginning of the Kepler mission? I mean, something similar what happened to HST, that something that was unexpected appeared?
The Kepler system and the detector system, everything worked very well, so there was no such instrumental surprises here. There were quite a few safe mode events, and there was a very high level of security and safety. So if anything unforeseen happened, then the telescope went in a safe mode. So there is quite a few 1 day, 2 day gap in the data, especially in the beginning, because everyone was very cautious. Any voltage levels or temperatures went out of our safety range, then it immediately went into a safe mode. And gradually, engineers learned how to deal with these, so they could minimize these safety events, these safety gaps. So we are talking about continuous observation, but of course there were data download periods lasting for a few hours, and there were such safety events that were also quite common in the beginning of the mission. But other than that, Kepler worked very nicely. But of course, there were a lot of surprises. Talking about planetary systems, talking about stellar astrophysics, and many other things. There were big surprises, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Any other question? No? Okay, so thank you very much, Robert, for your time, for your talk. And we can continue, I guess. So you can stop sharing your screen.